Palm Beach, Florida, March 1927. The house has been open for exactly 2 months. Marjorie Merriweather Post and her second husband, the financier Edward F. Hutton, have invited a few score guests for dinner before the annual Everglades Costume Ball. The hosts arrive dressed to evoke the court of Louis XVI. Their guests follow suit. Nobody finds this excessive. This is Palm Beach in the 1920s, and these are people for whom the question was never whether to build a palace, only how much stone to import. The answer, in Post's case, was considerable. 3 boatloads of Dorian limestone from Genoa, Italy, chosen specifically because it ages beautifully in salt air and takes intricate carving. Approximately 36,000 antique Spanish tiles, some dating to the 15th century, pressed into walls and surfaces throughout the structure. Around 20,000 roof tiles from an old Cuban castle. 2,200 square feet of black and white marble from Cuba for the dining room floor. A sculptor named Franz Barwig spent nearly 3 years on the property, modeling fantastical birds and animals directly into the stone at Joseph Urban's direction. Above the main public rooms stretched what sources call the 1,000-wing ceiling, a surface so dense with decorative detail that moving through the building felt less like entering a house than walking into a living theater. The 33 bathrooms featured gold-plated fixtures. Post was practical about them. Gold didn't tarnish and was therefore easier to clean. The living room measured 1,800 square feet. Its ceilings rose 42 feet. The whole thing sat on 17 acres of coral reef between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth Lagoon, and required a permanent staff of approximately 60 people simply to function. Post spent $7 million building it. Construction had begun in 1923, drawing some 600 skilled workers, even as Florida's land boom wobbled toward its eventual collapse. The house officially opened in January 1927. All told, in 1927 dollars, $7 million bought you something that had no real American precedent. She called it Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake in Spanish. The name told you exactly what the property was. Before Mar-a-Lago became a headline, it was a dream built by one of the richest women in America. Marjorie Merriweather Post didn't imagine it as a campaign backdrop, a private club, or a cable news location. She imagined a palace by the sea, a monument to taste, hospitality, and national importance. She filled it with carved stone, imported craftsmanship, and the kind of confidence only serial money 3 decades in the making could sustain. And then, in the strangest turn of all, she tried to give it away. Not sell it, give it to the United States. The tragedy is that the country didn't know what to do with the gift, and history did. Mar-a-Lago isn't simply a political property. It's the failed afterlife of an heiress's attempt to turn private fortune into permanent public legacy. To understand why it failed, you first need to understand the woman who built it. Marjorie Merriweather Post was born on March 15, 1887, in Springfield, Illinois, the only child of C.W. Post, who had recently relocated to Battle Creek, Michigan, seeking treatment at a sanitarium run by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. C.W. Post arrived in Battle Creek weak and nearly broke. He left with an idea. Kellogg's patients were being served novel breakfast cereals and coffee alternatives. C.W. developed his own. Postum, a coffee substitute made from bran, wheat, and molasses, went to market in 1895. Grape nuts and Post Toasties followed. By the turn of the century, the family had moved out of their farmhouse and into a proper mansion, and C.W. had begun taking his daughter to board meetings. He had no sons. He had one child, and he treated her accordingly, as the person who would inherit everything he was building. Marjorie attended factories, traveled on business trips, sat through corporate planning sessions before she was 20 years old. CW sent her to the Mount Vernon Seminary in Washington, D.C., where she graduated in 1904. She had owned stock in her father's company since childhood. By her early 20s, she had already begun collecting French decorative art and furniture under the guidance of dealer Joseph Duveen, whose other clients included John D. Rockefeller and Henry Clay Frick. The trajectory was clear even before the crisis that made it formal. On May 9, 1914, C.W. Post died by suicide at age 60, convinced he was terminally ill. Marjorie was 27. She inherited the Postum cereal company outright, an estate valued at approximately $20 million, which in 1914 represented a genuinely staggering sum. She disputed the will against her father's second wife, reached an out-of-court settlement, and stepped into full ownership. A 27-year-old woman taking sole control of a major American corporation in 1914 wasn't a common occurrence. The Library of Congress identifies Post as one of America's first prominent female business executives, and the record bears that out precisely. She wasn't given a ceremonial title. She was the largest individual stockholder in the company, wielded real influence over its direction, and eventually won a seat on the board of directors in 1936, but only after petitioning repeatedly for it, and only on the strength of a track record that had been obvious for years. The biography American Empress, written by Nancy Rubin and published in 1995, put it directly. Had Post lived in a different era, she might have exercised her power differently. Perhaps she would have been president of the giant General Foods Corporation. She wasn't, because the era didn't permit it. Instead, she ran households, orchestrated diplomatic entertaining, and accumulated the most important private collection of Russian imperial art in the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't a lesser life. It was a constrained one. The business accomplishments were real and specific. Together with her second husband, E.F. Hutton, the financier she married in 1920, Post pursued an aggressive acquisition strategy that transformed Postum into something far larger. Jell-O in 1925, minute tapioca and swan's down cake flour in 1926, Baker's chocolate, Franklin Baker coconut products, and log cabin syrup in 1927, Sanka and Maxwell House coffee in 1928. But the most consequential acquisition came through Post herself. Traveling on her personal yacht, the Hussar, she was served a whole turkey that had been flash frozen off the coast of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Clarence Birdseye had invented a technology to prevent ice crystals from diluting frozen food through a flash freezing process. Post grasped its commercial potential immediately. She persuaded the company to acquire Birdseye's patents and technology. In 1929, Postum was renamed the General Foods Corporation, the largest prepared food company in the United States. Post won her board seat 7 years later, on the explicit strength of the Birdseye judgment, among other contributions. She was one of the first women to serve on the board of a major American company. She was married 4 times. Edward Bennett Close, a New York lawyer she married in 1905, gave her 2 daughters before their divorce in 1919. E.F. Hutton, married in 1920 and divorced in 1935 on grounds of adultery, gave her Palm Beach, the General Foods years, and a daughter, Nadenia, who later became the actress Dina Merrill. Joseph E. Davies, a Washington attorney she married in 1935, gave her Moscow and the Russian Imperial Collection. More on that shortly. Herbert A. May, a Pittsburgh industrialist she married in 1958 at age 71, stayed until 1964. Each marriage recalibrated her social coordinates. Through all four, the money, the taste, and the ambition were hers. Her philanthropy ran deeper than the society columns acknowledged. During World War I, she funded a Red Cross Army hospital in Savonay, France, at a cost of $75,000. The French government eventually awarded her the Legion of Honor in the degree of commander for it. When the stock market crashed in 1929, she established a Salvation Army feeding station in New York City and personally supervised its operations through the Depression. She donated $100,000 to what became the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, and the same amount annually to the National Symphony for free public concerts. Gifts that continued across decades. Lake Merriweather on Goshen Scout Reservation in Virginia is named for her. Camp Post is named for her. These weren't gestures. They were a sustained argument, made through action, that private wealth carried a public obligation. The Wall Street Journal described Post as the consummate hostess, noting she entertained guests including Claudia Lady Bird Johnson. She changed her clothes 4 times a day. She hosted formal dinner parties for as many as 125 guests and personally chose every menu. She could theoretically set a table for 616 guests using her 18,000 pieces of Russian and French tableware. In 1957, she opened Mar-a-Lago to the International Red Cross Ball, and the gala continued there annually for decades. Her entertaining wasn't performance for its own sake. It was the exercise of a belief that hospitality was how wealth demonstrated its legitimacy. She was, at various points in the 1930s and onward, the wealthiest woman in the United States. The scale matters not just as an impressive number, but as the explanation for what she then decided to do with 17 acres of Palm Beach coastline. To understand what Post was building in 1923, you need to understand what Palm Beach was, and what it expected of the very rich. Henry Flagler had transformed Palm Beach from an undeveloped barrier island into the premier winter destination for American wealth, building the Royal Poinciana Hotel and the Breakers in the 1890s. By World War I, the social stakes were clear. Palm Beach was where wealthy Americans went to perform their wealth in front of other wealthy Americans. But in 1918, as historian Donald Curl documented in the Florida Historical Quarterly, Paris Singer established the Everglades Club, and the calculus shifted permanently. Until 1918, social life centered on the Flagler Hotels and the Beach Club, Curl wrote. The Everglades Club, with its expensive, restricted membership, allowed for a new definition of society in the winter resort. After that, the genuinely elite moved away from hotel registers. They built estates. The social season ran January through March, and owning a house, not renting one, not booking a suite, was a claim of permanent membership in a class that didn't need reservations. Post didn't merely survey the available plots. She reportedly crawled through dense scrubland with a realtor to find the specific strip of land that met her requirements. The 17 acres she identified ran from the Atlantic coast on the east to the Lake Worth Lagoon on the west, sea to lake, and no other available parcel in Palm Beach did both. The name was architectural before it was Spanish. It described a fact about ownership. She hired 2 men who produced something between them that defied easy categorization. Marion Sims Wyeth, Princeton-educated and already Palm Beach's established structural architect, drew the floor plan, 114 rooms on a coral reef foundation, built to withstand hurricanes, with the precise scale and placement of every space mapped out in direct consultation with Post. Joseph Urban, an Austrian-born theatrical designer who had created sets for the Ziegfeld Follies and the Boston Opera House, was brought in after Wyeth had established the structural bones. Urban handled the decoration, the fantastical elaboration, the theatrical public surfaces. The Prospecta Architectural Journal, in a 2019 issue on Urban's work, described the finished building as drawing on the most garish periods of Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Moorish, French design. The word garish was meant as technical description, not criticism. The combination was intentional. The SAH Archipedia entry on Mar-a-Lago notes that the structural architect, Marion Sims Wyeth, regretted his role in Mar-a-Lago's creation, a detail that, if accurate, suggests even the man who designed the bones eventually found the ambition overwhelming. The building had that effect on people. Beyond the tile counts and the Dorian limestone, the house contained 12 fireplaces, 3 bomb shelters, and an underground tunnel providing private beach access. Its 110,000 square feet glinted with gold leaf, Venetian silks, and the particular amber warmth of antique Spanish stone. Urban brought sculptor Franz Barwig, who spent nearly 3 years carving birds and mythological animals throughout the structure. Urban's signature contribution, the 1,000-wing ceiling, transformed the main interior into something close to permanent theater. Post had grown up learning what a performance looked like. She built one in limestone. She once described wanting a little cottage by the sea. Her exasperated husband, by one account, looked at what they had actually built and replied that the cottage had gotten somewhat out of hand. What she got was the most significant private residence built in Florida in the 1920s, and perhaps in the country. Flagler's Whitehall, the 75-room, 100,000-square-foot Gilded Age mansion completed in 1902, now the Flagler Museum, was the previous benchmark for Palm Beach private grandeur. Mar-a-Lago exceeded it on almost every axis. But the more important distinction wasn't size. Flagler built for his personal comfort and retirement. Post built for permanence. She built something she intended to outlast her. She was right about that. What she couldn't control was what it would outlast her as. What happened inside Mar-a-Lago during the social seasons of the late 1920s through the early 1970s was, by any available account, extraordinary. Post operated on a formal Palm Beach calendar, arriving in mid-January and staying through late March. During that window, the house was a working instrument of social power. Dinner parties for 125 guests, charity concerts, costume balls. In 1929, she hired the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus for a charity fundraiser and invited underprivileged children from the surrounding area to attend alongside her society guests. In April 1944, with the country at war and Post using the estate only briefly, she offered the grounds to World War II veterans who needed occupational therapy. A Florida memory photograph dated March 23, 1970, and attributed to photographer Bert Morgan, shows Post at the center of a fine arts festival held at Mar-a-Lago, still hosting, still presiding, at 83 years old. She excelled at dancing. A pavilion with a 30 by 50-foot dance floor was built in 1961, specifically for the square dance evenings she hosted. She served guests food from the General Foods catalog, elegant preparations of Jell-O alongside Fabergé quality tableware. A statement, perhaps, about the democratic ambitions of convenience food. Her entertaining wasn't merely social. It carried the weight of someone who believed that hospitality, done properly, was a public act. The Moscow period that followed her 1935 marriage to Joseph Davies built the parallel legacy that eventually became Hillwood. Davies was appointed the second U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union by President Roosevelt, and Post accompanied him when he arrived in the Soviet capital in January 1937. Stalin's government, under severe economic pressure, was liquidating Romanov-era treasures, Fabergé eggs, imperial porcelain, silver religious chalices, Orthodox icons, through state antique dealers selling nationalized property for hard currency to fund industrialization and armaments. She was in Moscow at just the right time, when Stalin and his government were selling objects for hard currency to build up armaments. Allison Hilton, professor of art history at Georgetown University, told PBS NewsHour in 2018. Post's status as the ambassador's wife gave her privileged access to those dealers in a way no private collector could replicate. She bought extensively and purposefully. The collection she assembled between January 1937 and mid-1938 eventually comprised approximately 90 Fabergé pieces, 2 imperial Easter eggs, the nuptial crown of Empress Alexandra, 60 Russian porcelain dining services, 25 silver religious chalices, and more than 5,000 Russian objects total. A University of Maryland master's thesis examining her role as the first American ambassadress to the Soviet Union argues that her social activities, formal embassy dinners, personal relationships cultivated with Soviet officials, weren't peripheral to Davies's diplomatic mission, but central to it. She was deploying decades of hostess expertise in the service of fragile Soviet-American relations and collecting one of the great art assemblies of the 20th century at the same time. She brought the collection home. In 1955, following her divorce from Davies, she purchased a 25-acre estate in northwest Washington, D.C. She called it Hillwood. She redesigned the property around the collection, built the gardens to flower during her spring and fall residences, and made clear from the beginning that after her death, the house and everything in it would belong to the public. "I want young Americans to see how someone lived in the 20th century," she wrote of her intention for Hillwood. In 1962, she formalized the arrangement with the Smithsonian Institution, announcing she would donate the estate along with a $10 million endowment to cover maintenance. Mar-a-Lago, she imagined, would follow a similar path. The paths turned out to be very different. Post had documented Mar-a-Lago's intended future in her personal papers. The Smithsonian Magazine, in a 2017 investigation into the Post family papers held at the University of Michigan's Bentley Historical Library, found a volume bound in red leather among the 57 linear feet of Post's personal archive, a file card dated February-March 1976, taped to its cover, labeled "Original Proposal for Disposition of Mar-a-Lago." The intention she formalized in her will had been taking shape for years. In 1969, 4 years before her death, while she was still using the house, the Department of the Interior designated Mar-a-Lago the Mar-a-Lago National Historic Site. The intention was visible even then. Post died on September 12, 1973, at her Hillwood estate in Washington, D.C., at age 86 after a long illness. Her will bequeathed the 17-acre Palm Beach property to the National Park Service to be used as a winter White House for presidents and visiting foreign dignitaries. The federal government accepted the bequest and took formal possession. For roughly 7 years, the National Park Service held title to Mar-a-Lago. Presidents never used it. Richard Nixon preferred the Florida White House in Key Biscayne. Jimmy Carter wasn't interested. The house sat largely unoccupied, watched over by federal caretakers who were learning what it cost to run a 114-room limestone palace on the Florida coast. The answer was approximately $1 million per year in maintenance alone, and that was simply to keep the building standing. One account from 1974 concluded that even $100,000 per year wouldn't be sufficient to properly maintain the property. Security compounded the problem. A public road ran nearby, airport noise complicated any credible use as a diplomatic retreat, and the perimeter of 17 acres required Secret Service resources that no administration could justify for an estate nobody was actually using. The house had 3 bomb shelters. It needed 60 staff. No presidential schedule had room for any of it. On December 23, 1980, Congress passed Act 96-586, formally returning Mar-a-Lago to the Post Foundation. The physical transfer completed in 1981. Congress also designated Mar-a-Lago a National Historic Landmark on the same date, December 23, 1980, citing its significance as an exemplar of the baronial way of life of the wealthy who built mansions in Florida during the Florida land boom of the 1920s. That designation was about Post's house and Post's era. It predates Trump's ownership by 5 years. It remains in force today. The Post Foundation listed Mar-a-Lago for sale at $20 million. Post's daughters, including Dina Merrill, didn't maintain the property while waiting for a buyer. Multiple deals collapsed. A developer named Surf Stanford Ross negotiated a purchase price of $14.3 million and then never closed. He failed to provide a down payment. Demolition permits were reportedly approved. The most architecturally significant private residence built in Florida in the 20th century came close to being razed for subdivided lots. In the summer of 1985, Donald Trump entered negotiations. His initial offer of $15 million to the Post family was rejected. He then purchased a strip of adjacent beachfront land from Jack C. Massey, former owner of Kentucky Fried Chicken, for $2 million, and announced plans to build a structure on it that would block Mar-a-Lago's ocean views. Competing buyer interest collapsed. The Post Foundation, holding a deteriorating property with no viable buyer and now facing an obstructed waterfront, accepted Trump's terms. In December 1985, he paid $8 million for the estate and its furnishings, plus the $2 million for the adjacent parcel. Approximately $10 million total for a property that had cost $7 million to build in 1927 dollars, and that the foundation had listed at $20 million. Post had tried to give it away. The country returned it. A private buyer acquired it for half the asking price. Trump converted Mar-a-Lago to a private membership club in 1995. By 2019, he had declared it his primary residence. What had been a national historic landmark about a woman's attempt to convert private wealth into permanent public legacy had become, in most people's understanding, something else entirely. The mechanism by which Post disappeared from this story is worth examining carefully, because it didn't happen through revisionism or intent. Nobody decided to forget Marjorie Merriweather Post. The acoustics simply changed. The National Historic Landmark designation, issued on December 23, 1980, is explicit about what it commemorates. The language cites the property's significance as representative of the era Marjorie Post built it in, the Florida land boom of the 1920s, the baronial ambitions of a specific generation of American wealth. The landmark is Post's house. The designation was granted while she remained a living memory in Palm Beach and among anyone who had attended the International Red Cross Ball or read about her Depression-era philanthropy in the Saturday Evening Post. But landmark designations don't generate cable news segments, and they don't dominate search results. After 2016, when Mar-a-Lago became one of the most heavily covered locations in American political life, the volume of that coverage was so high it effectively buried everything that preceded it. The PBS NewsHour, in a 2018 article about Post's Russian art collection at Hillwood, reduced Mar-a-Lago to a parenthetical. Post also had a winter home built in Florida in the 1920s. Today, Mar-a-Lago is better known as a resort and golf club owned by President Trump. The house that Post spent $7 million building, lived in for nearly half a century, tried to give to the federal government, and eventually watched be returned to a foundation that sold it at a loss. That house became, in that PBS sentence, a footnote about someone else's real estate. The American Castle book, 100 Years of Mar-a-Lago, published specifically to recuperate the pre-Trump history of the estate, acknowledges the problem in its own framing. The public tends to look at Mar-a-Lago as the residence of Donald Trump. The book's existence is itself the evidence. A house built as a monument doesn't normally require a retroactive argument for why it matters historically. Mar-a-Lago does now, because the name has been so thoroughly overwritten by subsequent association that the original story requires active recovery to reach a general audience. Hillwood tells the counter-story. The gift to the Smithsonian also collapsed. The Smithsonian, citing maintenance costs, returned the property to the Post Foundation in April 1976. Post had even provided a $10 million endowment, and still the Smithsonian couldn't sustain the operation. But the Post Foundation ran Hillwood themselves instead, and Hillwood opened as a public museum in 1977. It has operated continuously since then. Today, it holds the nuptial crown of Empress Alexandra, 2 imperial Fabergé Easter eggs, approximately 90 Fabergé pieces total, 60 Russian porcelain dining services, including pieces from Empress Catherine the Great, and more than 5,000 Russian objects, the largest collection of Russian imperial art outside Russia, exactly as Post intended. The collection she assembled over 18 months in Stalin's Moscow is now publicly accessible, permanently, because the institution that received it was the right institution for the collection. The contrast between the two donations clarifies the Mar-a-Lago failure precisely. Hillwood was a 25-acre estate containing a specific, coherent collection with a clear educational mandate. Anyone could see what the museum would become. Mar-a-Lago was a 17-acre operational palace requiring 60 staff, generating $1 million annually in maintenance costs, with a public road running through the security perimeter and no obvious governmental function that could justify the overhead. The federal government wasn't wrong to decline. The costs were documented and real. The security challenges were genuine. What the government couldn't do was find any president willing to use the building in the way Post had imagined it being used. That is the specific failure. Post imagined a house grand enough that the nation would want to keep it as a public institution. She was right that it was grand enough. She was wrong that grandeur was sufficient. The nation looked at the maintenance bill and sent it back. There's a documented reason this story finds its audience the way it does. Since at least 2016, viewers hungry for Mar-a-Lago history that doesn't begin and end with political coverage have been seeking exactly what Post's actual story offers: the woman, the money, the house, the failure, the forgetting. When the pre-Trump history of the estate has been told in full, the architecture, Post's extraordinary biography, the social world she built at Mar-a-Lago across nearly 5 decades, the bequest and its collapse, the response has been specific and consistent. Viewers and readers describe wanting history, not politics. They praise coverage that tells the story without partisan framing. They respond most strongly to the details that journalism rarely surfaces anymore. Post's Depression-era philanthropy, the scale of the General Foods enterprise, the Russian art collection assembled during one of the most fraught diplomatic moments of the 20th century. This is a story that has been acoustically buried, not historically exhausted. The research is there. The biography is there. The Smithsonian Magazine investigated the Post family papers at the Bentley Historical Library in 2017 and found the red leather volume. Estella Chung's Living Artfully, at Home with Marjorie Merriweather Post documents the 3 major residences through the 1950s to 1970s in specific visual and material detail. The American Castle book argues explicitly for returning Mar-a-Lago to its historical context. The Hillwood Estate, Museum, and Gardens, open Tuesday through Sunday, suggested donation $20, is 40 minutes from the Capitol and holds everything Post wanted people to see. The audience for this story exists, and is vocal about what it wants. It wants the woman behind the house. It wants the story before the headline. What remains of Marjorie Merriweather Post, separate from everything that has overwritten her, deserves its full accounting. She was born in Springfield, Illinois in 1887, the daughter of a man who had just failed at almost everything and was about to accidentally invent one of the great American consumer industries. She grew up watching her father build Postum from nothing, attended board meetings before she was 15, and was treated as an intellectual equal by a man who couldn't, legally or socially, leave her the same professional options a son would have received. She took what he left her at 27 and multiplied it. Under her ownership and direction, the Postum Cereal Company became General Foods, the dominant prepared food company in the United States. She served on its board until 1958. She was, by the 1930s, the wealthiest woman in the country. She funded a wartime hospital in France. She ran a Salvation Army feeding operation during the Depression. She gave $100,000 to build what became the Kennedy Center. She assembled the largest private collection of Russian imperial art in the Western world and made it permanently accessible to the public. She tried to give away her most ambitious building to the federal government and was turned away because the building was too expensive to maintain without an institutional purpose, and because no institution could find the right purpose for it. She died on September 12, 1973, at Hillwood, at age 86. Her estate was valued at $250 million. Her will distributed $117 million to her daughters and left endowments of $100,000 each to Long Island University, the National Symphony, the American Red Cross, and Mount Vernon College. She left trusts to maintain both Hillwood and Mar-a-Lago. One of those trusts fulfilled its purpose. The other found itself holding a building the country had already returned. The National Historic Landmark at 1100 South Ocean Boulevard in Palm Beach is still technically about her. The designation language says so. But the name that appears in almost every news article written about that property since 2016 isn't hers. In 1935, Post said of her fortune, "I put it to work." She did. She put it to work in hospitals and concert halls and a Salvation Army canteen in New York City, and a 25-acre museum in Northwest Washington, and a 17-acre palace between the Atlantic and Lake Worth. Most of that work is still visible to anyone who looks for it. The palace is the part that became famous for other reasons. This is the specific tragedy. Not that she was forgotten, but that she was misremembered. The house survived. The woman who gave it away didn't. Post built Mar-a-Lago so that America would remember what private wealth could give back. Instead, America remembered the house and forgot the woman who tried to give it. If stories like this, the women, the fortunes, the buildings that outlived their builders' names, are what you're looking for, subscribe. There are more of them than the headlines suggest.